So much, Roberto, and thank you all for what's been a wonderfully exciting and invigorating series of presentations and discussions over the last couple of days. It's been a really wonderful interdisciplinary endeavor and curated absolutely beautifully by Adele. So grazie di cuore, Adele, and thank you all once again for being here, and thank you for having me. Just by way of a very brief preface, as Roberto has intimated, I'm approaching our common topic very much from the perspective of a scholar of literature, and emphatically not as a scholar of or a practitioner of textiles. So I'll very happily be corrected on any faux pas that I might make in terms of my technical vocabulary, or indeed on anything else. So, as has been made wonderfully and productively clear over the last couple of days, the practice of weaving has a long history of deployment as a metaphor for the act of literary creation. Western epic poetry, as we know, furnishes any number of examples, and few more notable than Penelope, whose weaving and unweaving of her tapestry throughout Homer's Odyssey has long been understood in terms precisely of its metapoetics. Likewise, Ovid's account of Arachne, whose pride in her weaving ability leads to her challenge of the goddess Minerva to an ill-fated contest, readily divulges its metaliterary applications in the Metamorphoses. Though, despite the ample attention that's been given to weaving and its metapoetic usages, a key element of the craft, as I see it, has been overlooked in terms of its metaliterary value. If we look at any piece of woven fabric, as the warp and woof are overlain, we'll see that there is an additional element upon which the textile depends, namely the empty space between the interwoven threads. Though easy to miss, especially in the modern age of textile production, the shape of any woven material, however plain or elaborate, revolves around the interaction between material and empty space. This inverted view of the act of weaving holds true in its metaphorical and metaliterary applications. In his important book on literary absences, The Dark Matter of Words, Timothy Ward develops the notion of structured literary absences, absences which are rendered conspicuous by our cognitive faculties based on expectation, as opposed to pure absence, where no such expectations are established, and thus no such registration can occur. While laying the groundwork for his theory of structured absence, Walsh suggests that in terms of the aesthetic uses of absence, a work of art can be likened to a net, a pattern of interwoven filaments that, while nothing in themselves, and thus are nevertheless circumscribed and made visible by what there is, by the particular pattern spun by the artist. I'll just minimize that there so that hopefully it will be visible enough to you all. Can you all see that the quotations all right? Fantastic. And this is a metaphor which has also been taken up in broader philosophical studies of absence, such as those by C.B. Martin, who says that the fittings, the warp and woof of the presence and absence of something, are essential and complementary for one another. Indeed, the concept of an edge is the concept of the limit of where something is and where something isn't. Presences and absences are correlative, and both are involved in destroying, removing, and being at a distance from things. These conceptions of weaving and empty space are, I would suggest, highly applicable to the text I want to focus on this afternoon. Dante's Commedia, which maps the journey of its protagonist through the Christian hell, purgatory, and paradise, readily announces its ambitious project of drawing together the known universe legato con amore in un volume, bound up with love in a single volume. I'm going to quote mostly from Italian in the content of the presentation, but there will always be translations on offer, either sort of spoken in the context of those shorter quotations or on the screen in the case of slightly longer quotations. At the same time, though, it's a poem which is highly self-conscious and one which draws sustained attention to its own textuality and the limitations thereof. Part of the way in which this self-awareness is demonstrated is through the poem's extended metapoetics of weaving, a device amply attested in Dante's classical and vernacular intertexts and widely deployed by Dante himself in his unfinished Latin treatise on the Italian vernacular, De Vulgare Eloquentia, begun and abandoned some years before Dante began writing the Commedia. In the poem itself, then, the metapoetics of weaving is largely expressed through routine references to weaving narratives found in the poem's classical sources. The most notable of these is Ovid's account of Arachne, whose disastrous challenge to Minerva is described on the Terrace of Pride in Purgatorio, and in other ekphrastic interludes in the poem, including the episode I'll be focusing on today. Alongside its intertextual investment in mythological weaving narratives, the Commedia also shows a striking interest in weaving as a technical practice. In Paradiso 17, Dante's Crusader ancestor Cacciaguida prophesies his imminent exile from Florence, and its conclusion is framed in terms of the interaction of warp and woof. Poiché tacendo si mostrò spedita l'anima santa di metter la trama in quella tela ch'io le porsi ordita. Indeed, this instance of the weaving metaphor is placed in strong vertical juxtaposition with those found in Inferno 17 and Purgatorio 17. And it's the first of these which I want to focus on here, as it provides a significant example of the ways in which Dante's weaving metaphors exhibit an awareness of the interaction of presence and absence in the practice of weaving, in line with the observations made by Martin and Walsh in their modern studies of absence experiences. The Commedia, undergirded as it is by the tension between its project of universal containment and the spatial limitations of its own textuality, consistently draws attention to what it does not, and indeed cannot, contain. This is achieved through a broad array of strategies, including rhetorical preterition, for example, which allows Dante to suggest the presence of more souls in the afterlife than can be named, as in the vertiginous catalogue of the lustful in Inferno 5, delivered by Dante's guide Virgil. While elsewhere, absence is made explicit through the naming of specific individual characters who are conspicuously missing from the poem's narrative. The most notable example of this is perhaps the case of Guido Cavalcanti, the erstwhile primo amico, or first friend, of Dante's earlier narrative work, Vita Nuova, whose absence is remarked by Guido's own father in Inferno 10. These moments have received ample critical attention in their own right, as have the metapoetic implications of Dante's weaving metaphors. What's lacking, I think, is an examination of their cumulative contribution to what I would tentatively call the Commedia's poetics of absence, an aspect of the poem which, though highly significant, has been largely ignored by Dante scholarship. In what follows, I hope to offer some ways of approaching absence in Dante through the lens of the poem's own preoccupations with, and even thematization of, weaving and empty space. The numerologically central cantos of Inferno, 16 to 18, are dominated by Dante and Virgil's descent into lower hell on the back of Geryon, a hybrid creature drawn from the Commedia's classical sources, most prominently Virgil's Aeneid, but whose appearance also appears to have been informed by creatures of the biblical apocalypse and visions of the Old Testament. His appearance in Inferno exhibits a tour de force of Dante's descriptive energy and includes a specific and significant instantiation of the poem's textile metapoetics. E quella sozza immagine di Froda, sen venne arrivò la testa e il busto, ma sulla riva non trasse la coda, la faccia sua era faccia d'uom giusto, tanto benigna vedi for la pelle, ed un serpente tutto l'altro fusto. Due branche ave pilosi in sin l'ascelle, lo dosso e il petto e ambedue le coste dipinte ave di nodi e di rotelle, con più color sommesse e sovrapposte, non ferma ai drappi tartari né turchi, né forta ai tele per ragni imposte. These lines, with their heavy investment in ekphrasis and material description, present Geryon as a richly decorated, chimeric creature with the face of a just man and the bodily features of a vast array of animals ranging throughout the canto from scorpions to serpents to falcons, layered over with knots and whorls with finely interwoven colours. This is Gustave Doré's wonderful illustration of how he envisions Geryon, adhering to Dante's own descriptions. So marvellous is Geryon's appearance, in fact, that his arrival elicits one of the Commedia's most radical metapoetic declarations, in which Dante swears on the poem itself that Geryon truly appears as he saw him. Sempre a quel ver che faccia di menzogna, dell'uom chiuder le labbra fin che il puote, però che senza colpa fa vergogna. Ma qui tacer non posso, e per le note di questa commedia lettor ti giuro, se le non sien di lunga grazia vote, che vidi per quell'aere grosso e scuro venir notando una figura in suso, maravigliosa ad ogni cor sicuro. The marvel of Gerion's improbable form, that is to say, leads the poem into the first of only two moments of bold self-definition as Commedia. Indeed, Teodolinda Barolini has suggested that by virtue of his sheer multiplicity of form and the metapoetics inherent in his construction, Gerion constitutes a microcosm of Commedia itself. Given the densely metapoetic occupation of the episode, then, it hardly seems coincidental that this is also a passage which draws together the poem's joint interest in mythological weavers and the technical act of weaving, with its evocation of Arachne, the first in the poem, and its precise description of the coaction of sommettere and sovrapporre. It is also highly suggestive that, as Dante describes the movement of Gerion's tail, explicit attention is also drawn to the empty air around it. Nel vano tutta sua coda guizzava, torcendo in su la venenosa forca, ch'a guisa di scorpion la punta armava. Gerion's hybrid textures are, like the threads in a tapestry, highlighted in and around the context of empty space. Tellingly, these lines are the first of only three instances in which we encounter the substantive vano in the Commedia, and as such, these lines constitute an important contribution to the poem's extended thematic occupation with empty space. The question of otherworldly vanità is, after all, one of the most prominent and persistent metaphysical issues raised in Dante's afterlife, and especially in Inferno and Purgatorio, populated as they are almost exclusively by ombre vane, empty shades. Once it has been introduced in the context of Gerion's appearance, the vano around him becomes the object of an even more concentrated focus within the canto's central event, the downward flight on the creature's back. Like Gerion's body, the descent is framed in part by reference to its mythological precursors. Here, Dante adds further then to the mythological fabric of the canto by invoking figures of Phaeton and Icarus, easily recognizable to Dante's earliest readers as models of flight, whose flights end in disaster, as recounted once again by Ovid. Dante's descent, which implicitly casts him as a Phaeton or an Icarus in bono, sees him move through the infernal vano, which has been made so conspicuous throughout the Gerion episode, and all the more so through its prevalent metaphorics of weaving. The Dantista Catherine Powelsland has recently written persuasively on the participatory dynamics of the epistemically immersive descent on Gerion. Epistemically immersive is Powelsland's own phrase, elucidating the ways in which the reader is drawn into the multisensory experience of the journey. With the notion of structured literary absence and emptiness in mind, we might approach the cavernous empty space through which Dante moves in Inferno 17 through Powelsland's lens of epistemic immersion. The multisensory language of the descent is, after all, punctuated with experiential reference to the empty space through which Gerion descends. For example, these lines, Ella sen va notando lenta lenta, rota e discende, ma non me ne accorgo, se non ch'al viso e di sotto mi venta. Here, the infernal vano becomes the only visual point of reference in a canto which otherwise exhibits a superabundance of visual cues. Dante plunges headlong through the empty space in Inferno 17, and the poem's metaphorics of weaving allow for the careful delineation of this space so that the reader can more clearly and therefore more generatively engage with it. Powelsland suggests that the descent on Gerion in Inferno 17 offers the reader an excellent rehearsal space for the real challenge of modelling spatial presence in Paradise, where questions of presence and absence become, perhaps predictably, even more fraught. This is certainly true, and just as it offers us a way of exploring how presence is to be understood in the Commedia's later worlds, I would also suggest that it gives us an important way of understanding the method through which Dante constructs and makes use of conspicuous empty space. In this respect, Gerion's canto, like Gerion himself, reproduces in miniature the ways in which the Commedia as a whole operates in terms of its highly visualized and highly self-conscious metapoetics. But it is also an episode which, for all of its investment in visual and poetic textures, gathers in the poem's lexicon of emptiness. The result of this ingathering is a textual fabric which inflects and is inflected by the metaphorics of weaving which permeate the poem as a whole. The empty spaces opened up by the poetic warp and woof in Dante's Commedia provides us with valuable insight into Dante's generative use of empty space across the poem. And I hope to have shown here how the Geryon episode, so heavily invested in weaving, weavers, and empty spaces, serves as a programmatic example. As we continue to examine the finely woven texture of Dante's poem, we must, I submit, heighten our awareness and understanding of the empty spaces with which its threads, around which its threads, sommesse and sovrapposte, take shape. Thank you very much.